Welcome, Internet, to the Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing Fairbairn's short but very, very interesting article, Object Relations and Dynamic Structures, in which he's going to talk about the whole basis of object relation theory, and in which he's going to basically change the game, so to speak, or at least be a game changer. What I found very interesting in this article is basically he's gonna shift the whole premise of psychoanalysis. So I'm going to start with explaining the basics of psychoanalysis very quickly, but just for you to get the idea to then understand the shifting that occurs. So for Freud, because that's where all psychoanalysis starts, right? Basically, the individual is pleasure-seeking. He is bounded for the very first time of his life by the acquisition of pleasure and the rejection of displeasure, meaning that basically he is pleasure-seeking. All right, that means that he wants to enjoy life, all the pleasurable sense, like, for example, eating, basically having maternal care, etc., etc. But those are there for pleasure. So Fairbairn, is going to completely reverse the whole paradigm. He's gonna say that basically mankind, the whole of man, isn't pleasure-seeking as Freud used to think, but is object-seeking. So what does that mean? That means that basically people are gonna seek relationships first and foremost before even pleasure. And he says that basically pleasure is secondary to the object seeking. And that's something that I found very, very interesting, especially because, as I said earlier, it's a true game changer, because before that, we had drives that are psychobiological, and here he's saying, no, those things are secondary to the fact that we build relationships with people, and namely the primary caregiver, which is often, not always, the mother. And that's very, very interesting. So he's going to shift it, and it's a shift that's, I feel, full of meaning, because basically when he was explaining that basically little infants are looking for someone at the very start of their lives, to someone else, for, of course, for self-conservation, but not only, for also to open themselves to the world, to become an individual. They need someone there for them. And he says that, of course, there is, like I said, biological factors involved. For example, because the mouth is basically what's going to, the first way of feeding, and often the only way of feeding, basically it's going to draw pleasure, but it's the relationships that is first and the pleasure that's second. And in the same vein, basically it's going to say that when pleasure seeking is first, meaning that that's what takes precedent, basically that shows that object relations has failed, that it's already stepping into a pathological area, which is very, very interesting, because he's basically binding object relations theory and improving Freud's idea, because what he's saying in substance is that Freud's not wrong, but it's not like that it should be. That Freud himself was already seeing people that were pleasure-seeking because basically they needed to compensate the lack of relationship they had, or the bad relationships they had at the get-go, with pleasure. So pleasure is a way of compensating relationships, and I found that that was very interesting. It made me think also of drug addiction, because in a way that pleasure seeking in drug addiction is intertwined with anxieties like abandonment, rejection, and so on and so forth, which are very, very object related affairs. And that's something that I personally had in mind when I read it, and it made a lot of sense for me to read that we object seeking rather than pleasure seeking. And he also says that it's not only the human world, it's also the animal kingdom, because basically the animals too are object seeking, at least according to Fairbairn, which is, I think, something that's both, how can I say, something that's positively interesting, but also very risky, because if you know psychoanalysis, you know that basically psychoanalysts have always been very, very, very cautious and not to put humans and animals on the same level. Like, for them, there's a gap that is never fully explained, but I think it's because they don't want to really get into the nitty-gritty, and they don't want to make it an bioevolutionary model, which Fairbairn does go a bit into it by saying that basically breastfeeding, for example, is biological, and that's how the organizations, the states, stade de développement, I have it in French, basically the steps a child goes through to basically develop. He says that yes, there is an oral phase, but that oral phase is biologically linked, but it's because of object relations that it's there. It's not because it's first. And that's, I think, a very, very interesting point, that he says that it's not the phases that are important or the most important. It's gonna be the fundamental care given by the primary caregiver, which is gonna instill pleasure and organize the pleasure throughout the stages of life, for example, oral, anal, and genital. And he says that basically it's through the relationship that is going to be a lift, a sort of consolidation of those elements. But if those elements are primary, then it becomes pathological. It becomes a seeking for something that, in a way, will never be there. And he also talks, very interestingly enough, about mature dependence, independence, and immature dependence. He says that basically independence is a form of detachment of the relationship, and it's not a positive. It's something that's both an illusion and a way to withdraw from relationships in order to not have them. And he also speaks about the dependency, immature dependency, and the person becomes needy, wants stuff, and it's not something that's, it's something that's in a way abuses the object. It's an abuse of the object. It's not that much a relationship more than it is an exploitation in a way. He's not saying it like that, but that's the idea, and I'm trying to generalize his ideas and transmit them to you. And there's that other very interesting point that he talks about mature dependence. For him, that's the ultimate stage, so to speak. That stage is basically when the individual understands that he is dependent in a way to others and to relationships, and he accepts it, and he plays an active role in it. That means that it goes both ways. He both helps other people and lets other people help him in a way, in a form of virtuous cycle where the hope and the help and the love and care circulates. It's not all for one person or all toward another person. It's fluent, it's dynamic. And basically, he's very, very interesting in those areas. And I found that to be quite subtle, but a very nice shift. He also has this very interesting idea that basically about the second Freudian topic, ego, superego, and id, which I won't be going into massive detail, but he has his own topic, which is basically the libidinal ego, the anti-libidinal. Even he doesn't talk about that. He talks about internal saboteur in this article. And basically, he's going to say that if ever the object is insufficient or bad, meaning the primary caregiver or someone else, basically the individual is going to not become pleasure-seeking anymore. He's going to reject. His ego is going to become anti-libidinal. And if ever it goes really, really poorly, that's an extension. It's Guntrip that talks about it. The ego is going to become regressed, which basically means the person is going to withdraw completely and abandon relationships in a way. So I found that to be quite illuminating, quite eye-opening in terms of dynamics. He also states that basically there is a good, an internalized good version of the object which helps compensate or at least put on a leveling field the internalization of the bad object. That's what's going to allow growth, is to have both of them and to be able to bring a certain level of nuance. And to finish, he does state something that I would like to share, which I find very, very, I'm going to say interesting. I've kind of said it a lot, but it is a very interesting article. If ever you have the chance, 6 pages full of ideas. The last thing he states is basically that he feels that the id, meaning the unconscious mind, is not the only structure with energy, because often we think in terms of Freudian ideas that the id basically sends out the energy to the rest of the mind, that the ego, the superego, the ideal ego, all of that get the energy from the id. But for him, and that's very, very important, he feels that all the other structures have their own energy base, meaning that the drives are not just in the id, but also in the ego, the superego, and the ideal ego. And the id is only one part of the whole system, which I found to be quite an interesting idea, yet again. And he does say that he feels that it's bizarre that we only see it as the id having the energy, because basically it would just be like if, and he gives an interesting metaphor, very linked with the time because it was published in the 40s. It would be like if the ego, the superego, and the ideal ego were bombarded by the id. When he says that basically it's like an all-out war, and that's an image I think was very telling in his day and age. And he also states that because he was very isolated during those years, he came up with his own theories to try and understand things and try and mitigate gaps in his knowledge. In clinical cases he was seeing, because he was so isolated, there was no colleagues to talk to, and that his own creation of all those topics, of all those names like anti-libidinal ego, libidinal ego, and internal saboteur, basically were a way of trying to understand and make sense within his own isolation, theoretically, from other analysts, which is, I think, the best destiny a theory can have, that it's something that we use to understand and also to be understood. And I think that this article nails it perfectly, that it's both Fairbairn's understanding that he shares with us, and that understanding is, I feel, precious, even if mainstream psychoanalysis hasn't necessarily fully picked up on his ideas. Nevertheless, they're brilliant. And I would very easily recommend this if you're into object relation theory. I hope you like this video, and I'm going to close off.